Thumbs up. Okay, so let's make a start with today's symposium, The Disenchanted Subjects of Architecture Between Neoliberalism and Neobaroque. Now, this symposium has been kind of called and organised by myself, Douglas Spencer, and Nadir Lahiji, in relation to two publications that we're actually launching in the South Jury Room, just off of here at 6:30 this evening. These two books, as you can see there, are Adventures with the Theory of the Baroque and French Philosophy, and The Architecture of Neoliberalism. There are a number of areas in which our concerns overlap, and we thought when planning this symposium that some of the kind of key areas in which that overlap exists are around questions of enchantment and disenchantment, and thinking about not only the Baroque, but the way in which we might describe certain recent-ish trends in architecture as being neo-Baroque. We're each concerned in some way with the way in which architecture has an affective power over the subject, even though that might be used within a kind of rational apparatus. And we're each concerned in these books, to some extent, with how theories and philosophies of the Baroque have filtered through, obviously from Leibniz and others, but I suppose chiefly through Deleuze's book on the Fold and Leibniz, and then filtered through into architecture and an architectural appropriation of those ideas, the turn to folding, of course, in the mid-90s, and then a whole subsequent raft of related moves and trends in architecture around the Baroque, Neo-Baroque, complexity, the fluid, the flexible, and so on, that I try to name in my own book, The Architecture of Neoliberalism. So in the title of the symposium, we've got two pairs of related terms. So we've got enchanted and disenchanted, and neoliberalism and neo-Baroque. And we're interested, and it's not just us that's interested in this, in that our speakers are interested in the relationships between these things from different perspectives, and with questions about the politics of architecture, the politics of form, questions of the individual and individuation as they bear upon architecture and the experience of the city, questions of the masses too, and their histories. To say something briefly about enchantment and disenchantment, it's Max Weber, of course, in his very famous work, The Protestant Work Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, who borrows this expression, disenchantment, from Schiller. And in doing so, he's addressing the movement of the Enlightenment, of rationalism and rationalization, as a disenchantment of myth, a disenchantment of the world, a disenchantment of superstition, a disenchantment, a critical questioning, in fact, of all unquestioned belief, which is one of the hallmarks of the Enlightenment, of course. But the term disenchantment, I think fairly obviously, also captures some kind of equivocation about progress and what is gained and also what is lost within that notion of progress and the process of disenchantment. So each term, enchantment and disenchantment, can be positively or negatively valorized. And the kind of switching between those poles, is whether we see disenchantment as a positive or a negative, is kind of rapid, or perhaps, you know, always circling around itself in some way. And this is what Adorno and Horkheimer take up in their dialectic of enlightenment. So they properly, historically dialecticize the relationship between enchantment and disenchantment, but more so with an emphasis on myth as enchantment and enlightenment rationality as disenchantment. And of course, they talk about this, especially in relation to the Sirens episode in Homer's Odyssey, where they see that Homer's victory over the Sirens is this larger victory over myth. It's a victory of enlightenment over the mythic, over unreason. But on its basis, all sorts of dualisms, which are extremely fraught, are born. So the divisions, the dualisms that service patriarchy. So divisions between masculine and feminine, between reason and the passions, between manual labor and intellectual labor, between art as a kind of rarefied experience and more immediate forms of enjoyment of the world. And then to take us to how this might relate to the Baroque, there's a book by Jose Antonio Marival, called The Culture of the Baroque. And his conceit in that is to take another episode from Adorno and Horkheimer's dialectic of enlightenment, which is where they talk, perhaps the most famous thing from Adorno and Horkheimer is the concept of the culture industry and mass culture. We have to remember, of course, when and where Adorno and Horkheimer are writing the dialectic of enlightenment. They're writing it in the 1940s. They're writing it as exiles from fascism. The Holocaust is at the dead center, really, of their concerns. But equally, once they've moved to Los Angeles, they are, in some sense, overwhelmed and equally anxious about other forms of irrationalism, which they locate in the culture industry. So in the popular media, TV, radio, films, newspapers, that they experience at their most intensified form in America and in Los Angeles. And Marival, writing about the Baroque, tests this idea out by saying perhaps the Baroque, perhaps the 17th century, is the first moment of a culture industry, because it's where power, a particular type of power, takes the city as its medium, and particularly architecture as its medium, for a form of affective control over the masses that have started to gather in the city at that time, which is itself a rational project of control, but it works through the unreason of feeling and affect to kind of challenge the latent or emerging properties of reason that are coming from the masses at this time. And in my own book, although I don't say a great deal about those origins, I equally look at neoliberalism as an affective apparatus which calls on architecture to produce certain types of subjectivity, which are exactly the types of mentality that neoliberalism thrives on. So mentalities of flexibility, entrepreneurialism, and and the like, and individuation as well. So I will say more about the book at the book launch, but I really kind of want to stop there and offer Nadir a chance to make some comments about our two books. Yeah?
How we will proceed.
Yes.
Good morning. Thank you very much for coming, everybody. And especially thanks to our speakers who graciously accepted to be part of this event. John, Nina, Ivan, David, and Will. Unfortunately, we had our colleague to also be part of this event, Marina Laturi, but unfortunately she is sick. So, and it is a great pleasure for me, especially to be here among friends. And for this event, I immediately left United States after the election. So I am considering to be here for the next 4 years. If a dog or anybody can provide me with a 3x3 extra room, I don't need more than that. So specifically at this dangerous time that I'm here. I guess I should be very short because we are a little bit, we want to be on time, and I will be keeping time for everybody as we specified for 20 minutes for each of our speakers, and then maybe one or two questions for 10 minutes, and then we will so that we can keep up the time. So again, as Doug mentioned, from different routes and different intellectual trajectories that Doug and I took, at least in these two our books, we came to more or less to a same conclusion in which we have taken to task certain currents, a certain turn in contemporary architecture, at least for the last 3 decades. This is how this notion of, as Doug explained, how this notion of the, on one hand, neoliberalism and what I have called the Neobaroque, which hopefully when it comes to my turn in the afternoon, I will try to explain that how this term Neobaroque stands opposed to original historical Baroque in 17th century. But in architecture section of my book, but also Doug's, of course, I don't have the writing abilities and clear-minded and writing clearly as Doug writes, but more or less in different languages, in different way of approaching contemporary architecture, maybe as again, when the day progresses, we came to more or less harshly challenge the current situation in our discipline. So I should not say that more than that because it's already 10:30, and I will go ahead and introduce Nina Power. So we'll start. Again, is a pleasure to have Nina Power from outside of course, our discipline. Nina Power teaches philosophy at the University of Roehampton and critical writings in art and design at the Royal College of Art. Please, Nina Power.
Right, thank you for the invitation. Okay, I'm going to speak for about sort of 20 minutes or so roughly on the topic that says up there. It's quite broad, luckily. And I wanted to kind of combine a series of thoughts and reflections on this question of the collective political subject and how we might conceive of this entity. And I think one of the big kind of political challenges which would go across all disciplines and all ways of being at the moment is, I think, you know, perhaps a lack of internationalism. I mean, all of the ideas of kind of internationalism that we might understand from communism and other kind of political movements have, in a sense, been outpaced by what we might call the kind of I don't know, a kind of nationalist internationalism, like people like Trump and his allies in other countries don't seem to have too much problem relating to one another in a certain sense. And I've been trying to think about what a kind of left internationalism or resurrection of internationalism could possibly look like at this moment. And I think even talking about the kind of collective political subject seems like a kind of dispiriting task in many ways. And we might want to start to think rather about the kinds of implications and the affect and the damage done by neoliberalism and the certain kind of subject that has been constructed and that has sort of dominated our political horizons as well as our kind of individual behavior. And I think perhaps it turns on this question about what it means to be an individual in a certain kind of way. I think we don't yet know what it means to be an individual, even though we live in an era of profound individualism in many ways. And obviously, Doug was already talking about the Frankfurt School and so on. And I think one of these kind of political questions goes to this thing that people have been trying to resurrect, people like Hart and Negri and others, Virno, which is the question of polyvalence and what it means to be potentially capable of many things at once. And I know that there's a kind of general distaste for theories of human nature, but it strikes me that if we are going to have a kind of serious and political discussion about a new left internationalism or what something like that might be, it might be worth going back to questions of the individual. For example, we can look at the German ideology in Marx and Engels and think about the fact that they kind of make this claim precisely, like we don't yet know what it is to be an individual, you know, and that communism in a sense is the kind of the possibility of becoming truly individual together. Which I appreciate sounds highly naive, and I should have a cynical posture after this. One of the questions I've been trying to think about a lot over the last few years is the question of the public and how, in a sense, the state constructs mass or collective political subjects. And so one of the claims I want to make is perhaps about the definition of the public that the law uses, and I'm thinking here about public order offences and what happens in situations of mass uprisings, so riots, for example, as we had in this country. But I've also been thinking of it in a more kind of everyday or quotidian sense in terms of the ubiquity of the recorded female-sounding voice in public space. So that kind of recorded sound we hear all the time, and I've written a lot about the kind of the sound of the neoliberal city, and the way in which there's a kind of soft coercion that is being practiced by this kind of effective sort of soft policing of public space, and why so many of these voices are female sounding, something like around 70% of these recorded voices in Britain, which is directly kind of inversely proportional to political representation of women in Parliament in the UK, for example. So perhaps given the short time, I want to think then a little bit about this question of the public, and maybe then a little bit about this question of work, because it seems to me, if we're talking about contemporary theories of the political subject, that many theorists have tried to pin this concept or try to wire it through the question of labour, and what it might mean to kind of think about polyvalence as a kind of capacity, as a sort of potentiality that is all the time sort of being blunted or alienated, to use kind of earlier language, through the type of work that is being done and how we might sort of remobilize this kind of activity, if you like. So Hart and Negri, I guess, would be the kind of classic here in the sense that this sort of assumption in a Spinozist way is that being is communist, and that all the relations are already there in a certain sense, that we're kind of constantly in relation, we're constantly using language, we're constantly using all of our kind of capacities, although not quite in the sort of the fullest way, but that we can kind of flip the switch somehow and reveal what was always there already. I don't know if it's that simple. We can think about Badiou, and particularly the later Badiou, where he's talking about democratic materialism and the idea that in this kind of current world, there are bodies and languages, and that this is kind of all that circulates in a certain way. And all he adds is to say, except that there are truths. And I think this discussion that we're having about truth at the moment is a very revealing one, the idea of a kind of a post-truth age. I don't know if I kind of think it's a very useful way of putting it, but there is a sense in which the question of truth is on the table. Again, not perhaps in the terms that we might like. And so I'm kind of interested precisely in resurrecting what the relationship between a kind of internationalism and truth might be, and yeah, whatever that would mean. I think this question, to return to this question of work, if you think about kind of contemporary competing ideas about who's talking about work, think about the accelerationist project, this question about full automation, and the idea that we can kind of eliminate shit work and get robots to do everything. And then if we have UBI, then people will be able to precisely explore all their capacities in a certain way, and there needs to be a kind of a left platformism in order to kind of push these ideas. As attractive as some of those kinds of claims about work or the future of post-work or anti-work ideas might be, it's always struck me that there's something kind of profoundly missing in the accelerationist project, you know, this idea that if we just kind of, I don't know, go with the machines, if we just kind of, you know, speed capital up in a certain way, you end up like Nick Land. But anyway, but you know, there is a sense in which we don't, in the first place, or the accelerationist project doesn't, in the first place, understand perhaps what work is, or what types of work people are doing. And so I've been looking at people like Silvia Federici and others who are talking about the commons. And the commons is another kind of way of thinking about capacity or resources in a much broader sense, an environmental sense, in a global sense, planetary sense, and what it might mean to reverse enclosures somehow, or how do we resist enclosures? Are enclosures kind of complete? We might want to say, again, a cynical position would say, yes, of course, everything is enclosed, don't be ridiculous. Although there are obviously still battles over land, there's still battles over resources, over water, etc. But one of the points that Federici makes is about social reproduction and about the question of care, and the sheer amount of care work, that both paid and unpaid, and of course it can be commodified, that takes place, that in a sense is very, very resistant to automation, right? That's not to say you can't get robots to look after babies or older people, right? Of course, I mean, we live in a terrible, horrible world. I mean, these things will come true, right? But it doesn't make it okay. And I think if we start with the question of care, like on some basic level, and we think about relationality, not only in terms of those kind of capacities, linguistic capacities, the capacity to kind of communicate, but also the capacity to care. And I've been thinking a lot about the question of value and what it might mean to replace profit with care. You know, and to start with care as the kind of fundamental unit, right? And it's not an uncomplicated claim, of course. I mean, you know, on one level it sounds kind of quite naive, again. But, you know, as Federici puts it, in a sense, that work is always already going on. It's just buried, you know. And to start with the kind of the claim about full automation is to fundamentally misrecognize what work is already happening all the time. You know, and I think this is one of the things we have to be careful about, I suppose, is these kind of solutions that look exciting or look kind of futurist or futuristic. You know, and I think someone like Benjamin Noyes has done a great deal of excellent work kind of unpicking the sort of futurist assumptions and the kind of political I don't know, bivalence, we could say, of these ideas. You know, of course there was a kind of communist future, but there was also a fascist future. And I think we look like we're living in the latter. And whether the accelerationist project is strong enough or, I don't know, critical enough, in a way, to undo or to kind of reverse that question of who the future belongs to, right? Which I guess goes back to this question of the subject then. You know, how can we talk about a kind of collective subject? Is it the subject of the commons? Can we resurrect that language as Federici and Midnight Notes and other people are trying to do? And in a sense, I think that's a very materialist project in a strict sense. And I guess I'm always sort of oscillating between positive versions of concepts, and then critical versions of the same concept. So I said I was going to talk a little about this question of the public, because it seems to me, if we're talking about neoliberalism, that's the thing that kind of gets destroyed. It was an ambiguous term to start with. You know, again, not straightforwardly a leftist or rightist term in certain ways. It has a kind of, I don't know, relation to questions of the polis. You know, it's a kind of term that invokes the public, the people, but it also invokes the police, right? It's the words that is the etymological root for both. And I think what we've seen in the sort of under neoliberalism, if we want to use that word, is a kind of eradication of the social and relational side of the public. So everything that might be called a public good or a public resource or social welfare, if you think about everything from the closure of libraries to the cuts in benefits to the attacks on various groups of people, including the disabled, the attacks on housing, social housing, the kind of complete elimination of that sort of public good. At the same time as a kind of uptick in the repressive function of the public, i.e. the police. And so I've got very interested in the use of public order offences and what the state means when it talks about the public. Like, who is the public that the state invokes in order to punish particular individuals, and punish them especially if they are involved in group activity. So if you think about the riots in 2011, if you think about the kind of punishment of protesters, there is a sense in which really existing legal subjects, named legal subjects, are being punished precisely because they are participating in collective forms of public manifestation. And so this public order law, where they're using charges like violent disorder or occasionally riot, although they don't like using riot because they actually then have to take responsibility for the buildings and so on that have been damaged, so they tried not to use riot. So even in the riots, they used violent disorder plus criminal damage or theft. But the sentencing was incredibly severe because people were deemed to be participating in this kind of mass uprising or mass action. And so I think, you know, what happens in this situation where the only image of the public or the only notion of the public that's kind of, that exists is one that the state is imposing, in a sense, that is invoking in a legal context. And so when individuals are punished for their participation in these things, the state is not straightforwardly saying, we're punishing you because we're the state and we can, although in practice that's what's happening, but they are invoking this image of public order in order to do so. So it's a kind of mediating concept. And then the question becomes, well, who is this public, the public of public order? You know, is it a kind of default status quo, the idea that there should be some sort of, you know, non-action ever, a kind of default sort of blank status quo? Or is it the public of public opinion, right? Which is obviously itself a construct. In many ways, you know, this idea of public outcries that are often kind of media-led or manipulated in the first place. Yeah, and I suppose it's thinking about this both as a sort of spatial, a temporal, and a political question all at once. in that sense. Like, does it make sense to want to resurrect the concept of the public when we're talking about public space or public art, which is sort of art that no one really likes, perhaps? You know, does it make sense to defend this, this notion? If you think about Habermas and the kind of claims about sort of rationality and a public sphere and the invention of a bourgeois public sphere, which might hold politicians to account in a certain way, you know, does the media in the post-truth age have the capacity or ability to do that? Is there a kind of a citizenship, an alternative that could actually take that role of the kind of the critical public in a certain way? You know, when we're talking about the public sphere, I mean, do these kind of images actually have any purchase? You know, we know just in a kind of everyday sense that there's a profound ambivalence and ambiguity about how we relate to space. You know, we are never sure, I think, who owns what we're walking through. You know, even when it comes to things like railway stations, right? Ostensibly public, but also not public places. You know, they're places of privatization, of franchising, and so on. And there's a sense in which I think that kind of hurried rushing through these places is an indicator that we have like lost an understanding or been forced to lose an understanding of what it might mean to live in public, to have a publicness, or to even more to have a sense of commons, you know, of commoning, what it might mean to kind of actually have a relation of responsibility and shared ownership of land, buildings, etc. It seems so distant. And I think it's very interesting when we look at kind of contemporary protest movements like Black Lives Matter, for example, both in the US and in the UK, because there's a sense of a recognition that public spaces are even symbolically destituted in a certain way, like a kind of protest, you know, if you go and occupy Trafalgar Square, if you go and stand outside Downing Street, have a sort of a kind of profound symbolic loss or emptiness, that actually what you have to do is simply stop the everyday from working. And where do you do that? Well, the everyday is roads, it's privately owned shopping malls, it's, you know, places where the, you know, circulation perpetuates the status quo. And given that, the problem is with the reproduction of racism, the reproduction of police violence, how do you stop that system altogether? How do you block it from moving forward? You know, and I think there is obviously still a symbolic component, but it's also a direct intervention, right? Shutting down City Airport and so on, closing these things down. And I think this is a much more realistic recognition of the world that we live in. And I think when people criticize Black Lives Matter and Sisters Uncut for these kind of gestures that involve the spectacle, that involve commerce, right, they're misrecognizing the fact that a certain kind of public space, if it ever did work, is now profoundly over in a certain sense. Yeah, and I think I'll kind of leave it there on the question of that recognition and what it might mean to create kind of critical publics that don't reproduce the social, whilst at the same time bearing in mind the question of social reproduction and this question of care and how we might kind of think of a collective or even international political subject on those bases and not those bases of the capital and the neo-fascism that we currently live under.
Especially the question of what types of very different types of power seem to be simultaneously in play. That actually make it very difficult to talk about something like soft power or even to identify neoliberalism as primarily affective, perhaps guilty of, but that's because I'm talking about architecture. So where you're talking about the woman's voice,
Mm.
it makes me think not only of Siri, but the film She, and I'm sure you've got many other examples. So how you see that relationship between that form of power, which is almost kind of invisible deliberately, and those moments at which we see, the disciplinary, the penal society is still very much with us. And Foucault said, of course, that these things are always overlapping, rather than substituting one another historically. Does that ever? I wonder what you thought of that relationship, but also whether there is anything perhaps more radical in those situations where the state is forced to reveal itself as this essentially brutal apparatus to show that face.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're talking about this relation between societies of discipline and societies of control, it's very obvious that both the society of discipline didn't disappear. I mean, we have both now, right? So, I mean, everything, surveillance plus prisons, surveillance, and I mean, prisons are a really interesting thing in the sense that you live in a city and there are prisons in the city, and most people probably don't know where they are, even though they're often looming, grim, Victorian buildings that are quite visible in one sense, but also not visible in another. And there's a way of kind of, and even like courts, if you ask people where the nearest court is, they won't necessarily know at all. And it's not a kind of moral claim, although maybe it should be, but there's a sense in which we don't understand the city if we don't know where these things are and how they work and how they kind of link with surveillance in the kind of everyday sense. I mean, if you go to trials, if you sit in on trials, they have footage, unbelievably high-def footage of everything, like the state, that the state will use. It's their cameras, but also they'll get cameras from shops, from, and sort of, I mean, we know that on one level, right? We know that we're on camera, whatever, loads of times a day. But on another, I don't think we know, we know that, actually. And, they do use super spotters and they have, advanced facial recognition. There's no way they don't know who people are, basically, especially if you're involved in kind of politics or political action. And they will go after you. I mean, I think we've also got to not forget how petty the state is. It's both anonymous and deeply, deeply personally offended by particular people. Like, it will go after you, like, repeatedly. And, I think when we're talking about that, we also have to think about precisely these forms of structural racism, structural homophobia, is, in this recent case, the police are not investigating these things. Do you know what I mean? Like, there's a way in which, for them, particular groups of people are disposable, and other groups of people are the ones that need punishing repeatedly, and by doing so, you construct, the criminal subject and that kind of thing, and it's kind of something kind of obvious about that. I mean, your discussion about the intimate technologies, I mean, I'm less interested in the intimate technologies, although, of course, there is a feminization of the voice of those things. I mean, it's interesting, the early research on GPS things, so I think a German car manufacturer was the first to use, I can't remember, was it Audi maybe, and originally had a woman's voice on the GPS, and they got too many complaints from men because they were saying, I don't want to be told where to go by women. And so there's obviously a sense in which you can choose the voice in a certain way, like that choice becomes then built in. But it's still very, very gendered, and obviously these films are about kind of falling in love with the voice. And there's a sense in which, you can be a voice without a body or a body without a voice, but being both is somehow like the thing that fucks the polis up, right? And I think the gendering of that is not accidental, So you're either an image or you're a voice. And you can be attractive in one of those ways, but both is like too much, And I think there's something about the very founding of the polis that depends upon that split. That's a really complicated argument to make. But I think you already mentioned, in fact, briefly, those sorts of binary divisions between, the voice and the body, or, you know, reason and emotion. And, you know, I think that still happens. And I think there's something kind of paradoxical and perverse about, you know, the dominance of the female sounding voice in quasi or non, you know, actually non-public spaces, really, in neoliberal spaces. You know, that there is an assumption that the female sounding voice of the Sainsbury's machine or the tannoy, the recorded announcements, you know, is somehow less pushy than a male sounding voice. You know, it would sound too dystopian to have like a booming male voice asking you if you swiped your Nectar card or whatever.
But I think that, sorry, just a very quick response, but I think that corresponds, that has some relationship to what you said about we don't know where the prisons are.
Yeah.
Because in, you know, if you go back to the idea of Victorian prisons, and some of them still exist,
Yeah.
but, you know, they look like prisons and courthouses look like courthouses, but everything's much more kind of abstract and just looks like a general sort of array of efficiency.
Yeah.
Rather than using those kind of older symbolic procedures.
Yeah, but it's interesting that we can no longer see some of the older symbolic procedures in a certain way. Yeah?
No, I was going to say the feminine voice in a way is more robotic, and it actually embodies this idea of the more robotic kind of obeying. And anyway, but that wasn't my point. But I guess in terms of invisibility of the prison, I think it's actually that it becomes more invisible precisely because the security measures that normally surround the physical space of the prison are disseminated across the city, right?
Yeah.
It's more seamless in a way. So of course you can't tell in urban space when these, you know, barbed wire surveillance, etc., is now like spread across the city in itself. And I guess that brings to the point of the fact that with this infiltration of kind of signifiers of the surveillance state, it's about the fact that the state selects where to put them in certain ways, and it's about who's selecting and who's producing this space, right?
Mhm.
So then I guess just to bring it back to, I'm not saying like we choose where the cameras are, but just to bring it back into this point of the role of who produces that space, because then there's even the selection of these aspects.
Yeah, absolutely, for sure. And you know, I mean, there are two things. I mean, it's no accident that security guards, you know, their uniforms start to look more and more like police uniform. You know, that there's a separation. You can't necessarily tell, you know, like where the official line is drawn between these different kinds of occupations in a certain sense. You know, and yes, something like asylum centres, you know, if you take Australia as a very extreme case, I mean, literally, you know, redeploying islands, you know, to be places where you cannot reach, you cannot get to, and these are horrific, horrific places. But the same would go for asylum centres here, you know, that they are very, very deliberately placed very far away from almost anything else. The same goes in Greece. If you go to Lesbos and you go to Moria, you know, these are like, you know, I mean, they're often repurposed army bases and things like that, right? Army camps. But there's a sense in which that hiding of the visible is, you know, is so obvious in that sense. You know, and prisons are a different stage historically, I guess. You know, that they're still, in a sense, maybe supposed to be a warning, like, you know, if you are in this city, you might end up in this one, you know. Whereas asylum centres are simply a way of holding people in almost like permanent temporal limbo, you know, and sort of non-belonging, like the, you know, the kind of inclusive exclusion, you know, of the camp, yeah.
Please.
Hi Nina, I don't know if you can hear me. So I missed the beginning of your talk, so I just wanted to ask you a bit more about feminist critical. Okay, so I've got a mic. I wanted to ask you a bit more just about the kind of production of collective subjects through feminist critical practices that have worked with Foucault, with Marxism, but I'm thinking particularly about the intersectionality discussions and the extent to which that seems to be a very productive way of demystifying and taking essentialism away from some of these debates. And so I'm thinking about it also because of this identification of how Foucault both identifies the repression, but also can be used as a point of resistance. So it's the sort of intersectionality and then also the scaling up from small sort of ideas of feminist resistance or collective resistance into slightly larger scales, but particularly around intersectionality and whether you think there's any merit there, what it might be doing that could be interesting for people who want to produce, you know, resistive discussions.
Yeah, I think the history of that concept is very interesting. I mean, you know, Kimberly Crenshaw originally proposed it as a legal term to point out situations where, you know, multiply overlapping different forms of identity are playing a role, but the law cannot recognize them all at once, right? So the law doesn't understand the way in which women, especially, you know, she's writing about, are treated badly, not only on the basis of gender, but also on the basis of race, for example. You know, and that it's a kind of misrecognition of the law to understand that. And I think then what happens to the term, and I mean, very crudely put, but it gets resurrected in a way that, I mean, Crenshaw herself is like, weird, as a kind of way of, yeah, talking about overlapping oppressions, but in a way that's very, very, very definitive about the limits of identity, like identity as the kind of horizon of political sort of belonging. You know, and I think, yes, I think that there is something very important about the idea of intersectionality and something very true descriptively of people's lived experiences, but I think as a broader political project, it's more of a diagnostic tool, I think, is its use, you know, because the point would be to diagnose these broader structures. Why is, racism reproduced? Why is sexism reproduced? Do you see what I mean? It's not simply that one identifies oneself in this way, but presumably one wants to overturn these things and stop reproducing these things. It may be that we need to start from those forms of recognition of the way in which we are treated or the way in which we are constructed as individuals, right? But I think politics has to be more than simply recognition in that sense. Yeah. And then you were saying about the sort of feminist critical practice. Or is that covered in what I was saying? Or okay.
I wanted to ask a question about, so in the beginning you talked about care, and you talked about collective care as if there is this sort of militancy in it somehow against the power of the state or whatnot. I was wondering if you could talk about care in relation to state, as in the welfare state, and how could a collective care be kind of, be in a dialectic with the, with that?
Oh yeah, right. No, it's a good question. I mean, like, I think one of the sort of recent paradoxes of sort of, I don't know, left politics, if you want to say that, is you have, Marxists who are ostensibly committed to the withering away of the state, nevertheless desperately trying to defend the last remnants of the welfare state. And the welfare state was not it's barely a socialist project, but it is a social project, right? If you think about the post-war compact, if you think about what it was trying to do, in terms of some sort of limited redistribution, it also has very, very, it's a very, very difficult story to tell about how it works against immigration and how it was also a way of establishing a certain kind of national cohesion against the incursion perceived of foreign workers in a certain way. Anyway, it's a complicated thing to say, but there's also a sense of kind of desperation in the sense of, well, what happens when, people with no safety net lose the minimal, residuum of care, of state care, if you want a state provision. And also a kind of broader political point about, well, doesn't all this shit belong to us anyway? Like, like there's a kind of question of property, and a question of, the distribution of resources. That's sort of not really being asked. There's not enough time to ask those really big questions about commoning or the commons, because we're desperately clinging on to, like, this residual thing. And I think the question of care is to say something like, this is always happening anyway, right? There are fundamental forms of kind of cooperation and care which change our model of what it might mean to resist as well. If you think about the question of the strike in terms of like laying down tools or, walking out, right? It's much, much harder to do that if you're looking after a very young baby, right? What would a human strike look like in that sense, or a care strike? You know, I mean, obviously there have been kind of Lysistrata type, you know, sexual proposals, like what would, you know, what does it mean to withdraw, like sex, for example? What does it mean to use those things as political tools? But it's much harder, and Claire Fontaine and others have been talking about this idea of the human strike. You know, what would it mean to actually like strike at the level of the human, right? So it's not just a question of the paid labor you might do in this kind of older model, but of all the unpaid labor you do too. And this goes back to debates around wages for housework, you know, as a kind of provocation to say, right, if you're gonna like commodify and economize everything and pay us for all this fucking shit that we did because you told us we had to, you know, that we're supposed to do out of love or duty because we're women. You know, like there's something so brilliant about that move. You know, as controversial as it is, you know, it's precisely an attempt to recognize, right, the fundamental logic of the system. You know, to say, okay, none of this would be possible without all this stuff that we do for free, you know, that you have told us we have to do. You know, and I think, I mean, another very big question we could ask about the question of care would be, how does it relate to violence? And how do we think about how violence is profoundly gendered as well? You know, we think about, and this goes back to the question of the state, you know, when the state defines violence, you know, and it could be, you know, throwing a cone or whatever, or pushing a fence, that's violence, right? Or smashing a car window is violence, okay, as opposed to hurting or killing people, you know, which most rational human beings would regard as much more violent. You know, the thing you need to stop is people hurting each other. It's not property, it's not defense of property, you know, it's not the you know, actions that don't cause any harm to humans. But so the definition of violence is so messed up as well. We don't have a good handle on this question. You know?
Thank you.
And yeah, and how would we oppose care to that, in a certain sense?
You mentioned how the subject is constructed within the neoliberal order. My question is, how might the subject be constructed outside of the neoliberal order?
Well, yeah, sure, right. I mean, yeah, I mean, I think there has to be some sense in which we're always talking about that which can't be captured, right? Because otherwise it's like game over, right? So I'm not saying fully constructed, but I think we have to look at the real relations of power and affect that do very much try to create a particular image of the world, you know, and a particular image of atomization. I mean, if you think about how hard it is to actually atomize human beings, it's a lot of work, you know, to actually, you know, to break people's sense of belonging, relation, you know, interdependence. You know, I think people, you know, some people have a vested interest in alienation and atomization and constructing particular kinds of subjects, right? And even getting people to think of themselves as particular kinds of subjects. I mean, if you teach in university, most of the time you're dealing with anxiety, profound anxiety, like anxiety tied to debt. You know, this is how students are constructed to think of themselves in certain ways. You know, as subjects who are buying something, but also something they could be criticized for. So there's a profound contradiction and paradox at the heart of that, yeah? Because if you're paying for something, then you should just get it, right? But what's the role then of judgment? You know, what's the role then of possibly failing in this system if you're being told that you're a consumer, if you're buying product and the product is your degree? You know, at the same time, the kind of profound anxiety they have about, you know, actually doing okay or getting a 2-1 or, you know, is it doesn't make them demanding in the way that people thought, but it makes them very anxious. You know, and I think you can see how people are constructed as subject in these very material ways. And they're often contradictory ways, right? Like you're told you're 15 different types of thing all the time. You know, and how you relate to that is a political question in some way.
Very good. Thank you very much.
It's all right.